はい、皆さん、こんにちは。米国特許セミナーパテントターミノロジーです。このシリーズでは、特許用語、表現などをできるだけわかりやすく解説しています。講師は、米国特許弁護士であるブライアン・エプスタインさんです。はい、今回は上下方向の表し方について見ていきたいと思います。では早速解説いただきます。で、ブライアンさんお願いします。
Sure. So today's topic is Joge Hoko. And recently on Twitter, there was a discussion about Joge Hoko, and we're translating it as up-down direction or vertical direction. And so the question is Joge Hoko have one direction or two directions? And so the reason this topic is relevant to me is that this is the very first question I was asked at my very first oral argument at the U.S. Board of Patent Appeals and Interferences. For our newer practitioners, that was the court before there was the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, or PTAB. And in this case, I was representing a Japanese applicant. And the claim language was something like reversely disposed in the up direction and the down direction. And in this case, we didn't have an indefiniteness rejection. It was actually just an obviousness rejection. But, the scope of that phrase was a concern. And so the question I received from the BPAI is, what does it mean for the claim to recite that the element is reversely disposed in two directions? And so our position was that it was not reversed in only one direction, such as the up direction, right? You can't just flip it up. Rather, we thought that it was reversed in the down direction as well. And so, the top of the device becomes the bottom, and the bottom of the device becomes the top. And the court accepted that answer. And so, looking back on it, the application doesn't exactly have the phrase joge hoko, but it's very similar. And so the answer to the question, the context in which it's used will typically dictate the outcome for the translation.
はい。ごく最近にツイッター上で、上下方向について議論されていたのを見て、今回これを取り上げることになりました。で同時にこの上下方向の問題というのは、このブライアンさんがですね、過去に、USPTO、当時の BPAI というところでのやり取りの中で取り扱ったことのある、トピックだそうです。で、この上下方向に関する一般的な疑問として、この上下方向の方向は一つだろうか、それとも二つだろうかというものがあります。で、答えとしては、いつものことなんですが、文脈によってこの答えは変わってくるということで、これについて次から見ていきたいと思います。では次お願いします。
Sure. So let's lay down some guidelines. If we're describing something generally, we typically want to favor only one direction. So, for example, translating it as vertical direction. In the general case, it is more suitable to use a general word like vertical. And if this vertical direction becomes important later in our specification, then the specification will also clarify what happens when the object is up and when it is down, right? So there'll be an additional explanation as to the different cases. However, if we're describing as something specifically, we typically favor two directions. For example, the up and down direction. the reason is that we want to clarify that there are two options here, right? There's up and then there's down. And the concern is that if we say only vertical direction, we might lose some of the subject matter that we disclosed in our application. Because vertical direction does not require both directions, right? Things could move only upwards or only downwards, and that would still fairly be described as the vertical direction, but not as the up and down direction.
はい。ここではですね、上下方向についての指針について解説いただきました。で、あるものについての一般的な説明においては、一つの方向を示す、例えばバーティカルディレクションというのが好まれると。で、そして詳細に説明する際、2つの方向が重要である場合は、この up and down direction というのが好まれるということでした。で、これらの例について、ね、次のスライドで見てみたいと思います。ではお願いします。次。
So let's, this is kind of hard to explain. So let's give an example here. By general, we mean something like elements A, B, and C are stacked in the vertical direction. Here, the phrase vertical direction sounds concise and it sounds clear. And the phrase up and down direction would sound pretty unnatural here. It wouldn't sound like a native speaker. In contrast, an example of specific language would be elements A, B, and C are stacked in this order in the up and down direction, right? And the benefit is that this description provides a sense of the stacking order. To be fair, the phrase up and down direction still sounds a little unnatural. However, the benefit outweighs that penalty, that cost, because the phrase could provide additional information, such as the element A being on the top of the stack. Yeah, sorry. お願いします。
はい。ここではですね、先ほどのスライドの通りですね、一般的な説明では、バーティカルディレクションがいいと。で、ここでアップアンダウンディレクションが不自然に見えるということでした。でそして詳細な説明の方では、このアップアンダウンディレクションにすることによって、この、積層順のイメージがより明確になるということで、どちらかというと、このアップアンダウンディレクションとする方がいいのではないかということでした。では最後のスライドに行きたいと思います。お願いします。
So, maybe we have some more guidelines for translating 上下方向. So, for example, as we discussed, the context can give a sense of which translation to use. So, for example, gases rise vertically, not up and down. And the reason is that in this, when we're considering context, there's an implication about what vertical means, right? It sounds strange to say that gases rise in the up and down direction because they only rise in one direction. And similarly, that same logic would apply for a chemical solution in which a precipitate sinks, right? It sinks vertically, it doesn't sink in the up and down direction. There's also, I guess, a preference when we discuss familiar objects that move in both directions. And these are concisely described as being in the up and down direction. And what do I mean by a familiar object? Well, a familiar object that moves in both directions is going to be something like an elevator, a piston in an engine, an airplane nose, something that we all know goes in two directions. And in this case, the phrase up and down direction basically becomes a shorthand for this dual movement. On the other hand, unfamiliar objects probably will have elsewhere in our specification a specific disclosure of up and of down. And so initially we're going to use this this phrase vertical direction, right? Okay, so what do I mean by an unfamiliar object? Well, if we have some sort of like arcade video game, right? And we've got a spaceship moving and the screen's vertical, and we've got a spaceship moving. We don't really know what it means to move vertically, right? Does it move in both the up and the down direction, or does it only move up or only move down? It could be any of these cases. And so in this case, it sounds kind of strange to say that the spaceship moves in the up and down direction, right? Especially if we're later in the application contradicting ourselves. And so therefore, if it does move in both directions, that will be disclosed in detail later in the specification. And so when we're kind of initially introducing this object, we're going to prefer using the phrase vertical direction. And while we're kind of, discussing different situations and how we might consider them, it's important to remember that a figure can always provide additional disclosure if we cautiously translate joge hoko as vertical direction, right, as one direction. And that's important, right? If we need to amend our claims based on whether it's, one direction or two directions, that, at least in America, that figure can provide a basis for amending in, both directions, right? And so therefore it's acceptable to more cautiously translate joge hoko as vertical, because any potential problem could work itself out based on that figure. And of course, there should be a figure if the direction of movement is important to the invention. お願いします。
はい、ここではさらなる指針について解説いただきました。で、例えばエレベーターのように上下のこの2方向に動くものとして、馴染みのあるものというのはこの up and down direction と簡潔に2つの、方向について簡潔に表現できるということでした。一方でこの馴染みのないものはこのバーティカルを使うのがいいということでした。で、馴染みのないものにこの up and down direction を、使用するときというのは、明細書でこれについての詳細な説明が必要だろうということでした。はい、今回は上下方向の表し方について解説いただきました。今回はこれで以上になります。ご質問や扱ってほしいトピックなどがありましたら YouTube のコメント欄に書いていただくか、スライド最後に記載のメールアドレスまでお気軽にご連絡ください。では本日もありがとうございました。失礼します。
ありがとうございました。